Alright, folks, bear with me. I am recovering from being sick, and so I'm probably going to have to edit this one a little bit more than normal just to take out the sneezes and the coughs, but I also want to make sure this gets out soon, so here we go. This is the spotlight for Photon. She is the third character that I have designed, and I really, really like her. A lot of people ask me who's your favorite character that you've built, and the answer that I always give that is sincere is whichever one I'm playing at the moment, and that does include her. So, going through some of the base stats real quick, I do want to talk about her prestige real quick, but she lands almost exactly halfway in between Valkyrie and Doom in that space there that no one else has been in for a bit. And that means that she is one of the highest prestige 7 stars. It's not going to show up right away because Sunspot and Gambit and a couple others have really weird curves in the low ranks, but she is going to age very well as we start getting up into the ranks. And looking forward toward rank 5 and even rank 6, she does come in ahead of almost everyone else besides Silver Surfer. So, nice long-term goal there. She also has pretty solid prestige, even at SIG 20. Touching on her attributes real quick, she has survivability of 3, but honestly, if you run max inequity, that probably looks more like 3.5 or maybe even 4, depending on how good you are at blocking, basically. She has really solid block proficiency, little bit of situational regen, and a lot of debuffs at her disposal, as well as some energy resist, but not a whole lot else. Damage is 4, but that is not going to feel like a 4 in Battlegrounds. That's 4 in the overall game. She has persistent charges, and so on quest boards, she's going to hit really, really hard. But in Battlegrounds, you are going to need a little bit of time to ramp things up. So keep that in mind. Ease of use, I'm giving her a 3 because to play her, the basics are you basically just parry and use combos and then throw your specials. There's a nuance to her, but she is intentionally the easiest character to play that I have designed thus far as getting a good chunk of her ceiling out of her. Utility, she has 3. She has a lot of debuffs, but most of them are kind of focused on her core kit, but she definitely has some really cool, unique things that she can do. And then Defender Strength is the big one. She is aimed as a 4.5 defender. It's funny because we'll talk about it as we go. There are parts of her kit that people probably think are too much or excessive. I've already seen some talk of that. I'm not sure she went far enough, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go. But the goal here is 4.5 post-buff Attuma level defender. So, going over strengths, like we said, she doesn't have the most utility, but the utility she has is very unique, and part of that is her immunities. She is fully immune to neutralize with her SIG, she's immune to power steal out of the get-go, which very few champions are, and those just make her very good against mystics. She's also one of only a few science champs that are immune to bleed, and given that Thing is more of a defender, Luke Cage is outdated, and Sandman maybe isn't quite hitting as hard in Battlegrounds as people want at the moment, that has real value. Additionally, she has really strong miss counters. She has access to a blanket miss counter when you ramp her, but her mediums can't miss at any time, meaning that she is extremely helpful for fighting characters like Spidey Supreme or Kitty Pryde. Just really nice piece of utility there. And she is a dangerous defender. That is just a strength of hers. Already touched on that a bit. We will talk about it more as we go. For weaknesses, this is kind of a weird one because I could have included as a strength of hers that she doesn't need her debuffs to stick because she ramps just by applying them, kind of like Titania. But at the same time, she is better when they do stick. And so if you're facing a skill champion with a lot of Purify and she isn't able to land the ones that do affect how the fight goes or the few that actually affect her utility, she will be a bit worse, so watch out for that. Additionally, ability accuracy reduction really hurts her because that's kind of the next step, right? Her debuffs don't need to stick for her to ramp, but they do need to apply. And so if they don't work, she just kind of stops working. Additionally, her offensive output is pretty dependent on punishing the opponent's specials for maximum uptime tempo. If you're not concerned about the speed with which you get through a fight, then this weakness gets a big asterisk next to it because all that affects is your uptime. But in battlegrounds, particularly, getting those high scores is going to be very dependent on that. Moving on to the actual abilities, we start with something that works really well for her both on offense and defense. When she is stunned, because she is, made out of living light, she loses control of her solid form and goes untouchable. I love this one. I'm very proud of the flavor. And then if an opponent misses during this effect, it goes on cooldown for 8 seconds. So this generally makes it difficult to just parry combo against Photon. You can parry, hit into it, put it on cooldown, and then parry again, but doing so is going to ramp her, so you have to be pretty careful with that. And it's also really great against encroaching stun or just any of the other times that stun is used as a defensive weapon. I also want to point out this one does work just when stunned, not just on stun debuffs, so this will happen on passives as well. Additionally, we already mentioned she is immune to both bleed and power steal. Nice set right there. She can trigger the parry mastery against non-contact attacks, so this means that she can parry, maw, havoc. Wouldn't recommend havoc, but she's quite good against maw. She's that much better against somebody like Professor X. There are just a lot of places where this is a nice little piece of utility that was mostly missing from the science class until now. Quicksilver can do this, but only once ramped. I believe she is the only other science champion with this utility, and it is extremely helpful. Plus, all of her attacks deal energy damage. That means that she can get around somebody like Korg if you really need to. It also means she does extra damage to anybody with energy vulnerability, etc. This next ability is kind of weird. She inflicts a half-second 80% Petrify passive whenever the opponent is inflicted with a debuff. I think I need to give a little bit extra insight into the design process for this one. Basically, what I wanted to do was give her, as a science character, a weapon that could be used against mystic defenders placed on masochism and conflictor nodes, because that is a very common tactic to make them stronger, because you're effectively putting a skill defensive trick on a mystic defender. That makes it very difficult for science characters to answer it. But Photon is going to get around the power gain and the regen from that with this Petrify. But there is almost no blowback on the rest of the skill class because they do not have native regen or power gain mechanics, and some of them are outright immune to Petrify. So this was a way of allowing her to get around Purify mechanics, but aimed far more at mystics and not backwards in the class wheel at skills. Whether you think that works or not, I do really like the way this ability turned out, and it also gives her a nice little tool against Mystic Dispersion. She is not buff immune, but as long as she is hitting the opponent when the dexterity buff on her ends, she is going to cut Mystic Dispersion by 80% because of that Petrify. So really powerful ability. It also means she combos well with Despair in reducing the opponent's healing, but only if they actually have healing, which is why we're going to get to this next point. She does turn off the willpower mastery for her opponent. I know a lot of people are going to read this as just a big middle finger to people who run the recoil tree. That is not its intent. This was maybe the last ability I added to her because I was trying to avoid doing this. But between the Petrify and all of the debuffs she applies, there was basically a massive delta between both how strong she was on offense and how scary she was on defense if she had Despair or not. Because without Despair, it wasn't really an important note, But with Max Despair, because of all the debuffs, she was just melting attackers who were doing everything right because she was reversing their willpower, and her offensive damage spiked significantly. As a designer, I do not consider that acceptable. Um, it was pointed out to me that the optimal way to counter her then would include turning off willpower, like you do against Warlock sometimes, and I didn't like that. That felt like another hoop that people had to jump through, and so we removed willpower. That's going to hurt fighting her with recoil, but it is better than the alternative, because you are just not getting healing as opposed to having your healing reversed. Moving on to basic attacks, as I mentioned earlier, her medium attacks cannot miss. This is not an ability accuracy thing, this is just blanket. Her medium attacks cannot miss. So, like we mentioned, really good for Spidey Supreme, for punishing Kitty Pryde specials while she is phased, and just a whole host of other annoyances. You can get in those mediums to land hits, regardless of falters or other effects. And then Photon's basic attacks in general all are associated with a different debuff. Her mediums apply a suppression, her light attacks apply energy vulnerabilities, and her heavy attack applies asunder. The medium and the heavy are symmetrical, meaning that when an opponent hits her, or you as an attacker hit her as a defender with a medium or heavy, those debuffs go on you too. So that suppression is going to make it a little bit harder to gain power against her. The Sunder is probably going to be mostly willpower healing, but it does mean that if she hits you, you can't rely on crit resistance, like, say, for Killmonger. And the energy vulnerability you only have to worry about on an unduped Photon if she hits you. We'll get to that later when we cover her SIG. But I do want to point out the suppressions only have a max stack of 2, so they only get up to 20%. This is not intended as an actual power control ability. Instead, this is mostly a tool to allow Photon to be more aggressive, to feel that much safer pushing her opponent over their next bar of power, baiting out the special, and then punishing it. I already mentioned that's kind of the core of her loop. This facilitates that. She blunts Mystic Dispersion, she doesn't get rid of it or reverse it, and she blunts combat power rate, albeit quite a bit less, as a way to make sure that she can be aggressive without it being too much of a risk. The energy vulnerability is just going to magnify all of her damage. We already talked about how all of her attacks deal energy, so this just means more of that. And then Sunder, because we haven't talked about it yet, and I know not everyone is familiar with it, locks crit resist at 0, so this allows her to crit easily against Rintrah, Doctor Doom, Absorbing Man. Very good ability. Moving on to Electromagnetic Charges, this is the core ramp part of her kit. This is obviously inspired by Captain Marvel movie, has the same max stacks of 25. They are also persistent between fights, and you only have a couple ways to ramp them. We mentioned earlier that missing against her ramps, so that's plus 4 charges. It does have a cooldown though, so you don't have to worry about double hit mediums triggering this charge gain twice. You don't have to worry about any of that. It's just the first time that you miss within one of her untouchables, she is going to get 4 charges. Additionally, you're going to get 1 charge whenever the opponent is inflicted with a debuff, or when the opponent activates a special attack. Special attack obviously hits Mystics because they tend to throw more specials. And the debuff thing we really need to talk about, because this is not just personal debuffs. This will trigger off of nodes. That's part of her intended defensive threat. But I also want to point out that this does mean that she will ramp twice as fast against Kingpin. I've seen a lot of comments saying, oh, Kingpin's just going to eat her up. And he will ramp very quickly because of all the extra debuffs. He will hit very hard. But he is also going to feed Photon almost twice as many electromagnetic charges as anyone else, because he will be inflicted with a suppression, which counts as 1, and then he will purify that and gain a rage, which counts as 2. So be careful with that matchup. It's going to work a lot unless it doesn't. So the reason you care about electromagnetic charges is that they allow you to enter pure light form. This is the purple that you saw on the deep dive. So she has most of the same rules as Captain Marvel movie on how to enter pure light form. You can be at 10 charges or more, dodge back and hold block, or be knocked down. Both of those work. This happens automatically when you get to 25, and then she has one extra trigger, which is that when she activates a special attack as a defender with 15 or more charges, she automatically enters this. So this means that you are more likely to actually have to deal with this once she gets over 10. You can't just hope to close the fight out before getting her to 25. When she enters pure light form, she gets a Fury passive for every 5 charges, increasing attack by, I believe these are about 25% of her base attack. So the Furies aren't quite as strong as Captain Marvel movies, but they are passives, and so a lot less interactable. Photon cannot miss at all during this form. Like I said, this is not ability accuracy reduction, this is just she can't miss. So that is a huge piece of utility while she's in this mode, and personal debuffs expire 50% more slowly. This is the fall off tech that Cassie uses with her poison. So the debuffs are not getting a longer duration as they apply, which is the way a lot of older things work. Instead, it's just all of her personal debuffs start expiring more slowly. So even if they're already there, they just slow down how much they're ticking through the duration, and then when pure light form ends, they go back to ticking normally. So it's effectively giving you twice as much duration, but only during this form. Very powerful ability, lets her ramp all of her energy vulnerabilities, sunders suppressions that much better, especially the energy vulnerabilities. Additionally, Photon cannot gain electromagnetic charges in this form, and I mean cannot gain. It is turned off. There is no ability that gives her more, like you're used to with CMM. Once she goes into this, she cannot get more. Part of the reason that that is helpful, though, is that she also does not have a trigger to just lose half of them like CMM does when you knock her down. Each charge lasts 0.9 seconds, so she does tick through them a little faster than CMM, and they fall off one at a time. All effects are removed when charges fall to 0. So, another consequence of pure light form is that her special attacks cannot be avoided with the Dexterity Mastery. I've seen a lot of feedback on this, a lot of people don't appreciate it, but there are ways around this, right? She can't miss, so you can't use somebody like Miles, but they can be evaded, so Spider-Gwen can get around her special attacks. Somebody like Ronan, with his guaranteed evade, can get around them. You can also use somebody who can block unblockables, of which there are a few. Or, what I'd like you to do is you can use somebody with ability accuracy reduction, including Tranquilize, and just not get the debuffs on yourself at all, and avoid pushing her into this mode. That is the key defensive ask of Photon, is to avoid ramping her in the first place. The consequences of allowing her to ramp are as severe as they are because it is realistic to not let her do so. There are a lot of champions, maybe too many champions, that can get around this basic threat, and that's why the threat is pretty severe. So, obviously, watch for that. We'll talk about how this plays into the specific specials when we get to them, but yeah, she turns off Dex. Electromagnetic charges also pause during the opponent's special attacks, and for 3 seconds when she punishes a special. Like I said, this is the key offensive skill ask for her, is you want to push the opponent over their bars of power, get them to throw a special, and then punish that special to try and keep pure light form paused. She will still get good results if you don't do this, but the difference between pure light form lasting its base duration of 0.9 seconds times 25 charges and lasting much, much, much longer than that because it's paused a bunch of times is pretty drastic in terms of her overall damage output. The Special 1 inflicts an overload debuff on activation. We've seen this debuff before on Danny. This is the energy version of trauma. Any damage dealt by hits, either landed hits or into block. A portion of it is then reapplied as energy damage. Additionally, keep in mind that because Photon puts energy vulnerabilities on the opponent, those effectively apply twice. What I mean by that is that the energy damage of her basics is magnified by the energy vulnerabilities. And then that damage, that hit damage, is read by the overload, multiplied by a percentage, and you get a red number that is then also magnified by the energy vulnerabilities. So if you have a 50% energy vulnerability on the opponent, total, right? And you have, let's say, a single 10% overload on them, then you're going to have, let's say your hit deals 100 damage. So that's actually going to become 150 damage. And then the overload is going to say you get to do 15 more damage. And then that 15 is also going to be multiplied by the 50%, so you're going to get to 22.5, meaning your initial hit of 100 ends up dealing 172.5 damage. So the energy vulnerabilities are larger than they look, is basically what I'm trying to say, because of the overload. And if Pure Light Form is active, then you inflict a second overload debuff, and these can stack up to 10 seconds. Remember that these are going to expire more slowly during Pure Light Form, and so they can feel like they're more like 20 seconds long. Now the controversial part, in Pure Light Form, the final hit is passively unblockable, except against well-timed blocks. So again, there are a number of ways to deal with this. You can block unblockables. You can reduce unblockable ability accuracy because it is a passive, so somebody like Anti-Venom will work, or even Infamous Iron Man if you're crazy enough to go that way. Or you can well-time block it. This is not like Quicksilver, where it's 3 hits in rapid succession that are all fairly difficult to parry. This is just the last hit, and there's enough of a wind-up that this is definitely doable. So I encourage you to practice it. It's not that bad at all. The special one is the one that you want to bait if you are pushing her into Pure Light Form. Ideally, you parry the first hit. Not because you have to, you can just block it, but because that'll reduce the damage you take from it. You outrange the second hit, and then the third hit you parry again so that you can block it. You can take very low amounts of damage from her special 1, even in Pure Light Form, if you get that down. So moving on to the special 2, this is her tempo special. The special 1 is about damage, the special 2 is about tempo and controlling the fight through staying aggro, basically. It applies a taunt. Base duration is 10 seconds. Remember, during Pure Light Form, that's going to feel like 20, and so that's going to keep the opponent throwing their specials more often. There is no potency specified, so this is also a 40% weakness, which is going to be really strong for her. That means that if you're running max inequity and keeping a bunch of debuffs on the opponent, it's going to feel like a 76% weakness, which effectively means she has 4 times the effective health that would be listed on her ability page. So that's what I mean when I say if you run inequity and you throw a lot of special 2s, it's going to feel like her survivability is higher. And then it also pauses electromagnetic charges during it and gives you an untouchable if you are in Pure Light Form. And that means that your opponent is likely going to throw their special immediately after because of the taunt. It's going to miss you because of the untouchable, and then you're going to be set up that much better for hitting into the opponent afterwards and getting credit for punishing their special and getting that nice little pause. So this special just keeps you rolling. The way I like to play her, and Karate Mike did show this on the deep dive, is generally throw a special 2 first, right as you go into Pure Light Form. That way you get the untouchable, you get the taunt, and then spam special 1s. Because you want the taunt up for as long as possible, that full 20 seconds for tempo reasons, and then you want the damage from the special 1. Now, as a defender, odds are the only thing in here you're going to care about is the fact that this whole special, which is 4 full screen beam attacks, is unblockable when you can't dex it. That is intentional. This is the thing you should avoid. If you are fighting a defending Photon and you don't have a way to control pure light form, if you don't have a way to keep her from ramping her charges, you really need to bait the special one. If you don't, this is supposed to be the end of the fight. That the special 2 is the kill threat. If you're fighting her with power gain, which I know people are going to call out, then it's that much more important to use a counter. She is a very difficult defender. There are supposed to be nodes that make her feel really spooky, and this special 2 is going to be part of that. Like I said, you can also block unblockables. There are a number of characters that can do that. Mole Man can handle her pretty decently once he goes into Frenzy because of that. You could also use somebody like like Anti-Venom, like I mentioned, and just try and bypass the unblockable entirely, because it is subject to ability accuracy, or you can use somebody like Spider-Gwen. All of these are options. Moving on to the Special 3, you're not likely to use this in short fights. This is more of a longer content special, as is kind of the pattern with Special 3s. It raises the max stacks of electromagnetic charges by 5 up to 3 times. That means your max charges can go as high as 40. The reason this matters is that that's going to give you more uptime in the form, more chances to pause. It's also going to raise your ceiling from 5 Furies to 8 Furies. That means the extra attack goes from 125% of base to 200% of base. It is a very noticeable difference, but it does require 9 bars of power to get there, so like I said, definitely something for very long fights. It's fun to do when it matters. The other thing the Special 3 is going to do is that this is the one source of regen she has in her kit, and it's an interesting regen. So you have to be above 20 charges. You don't have to be in pure light form, because then the Special 3 would actually get worse as you throw it, because the max keeps going up. But as long as you're above 20 charges, you get this relatively short 8-second regen passive that deals that heals for 6% of her health. Except that it pauses for half a second whenever the opponent is struck. So if you can plan out this Special 3 properly and throw it so that the opponent then immediately comes in, you parry them, you hit them a bunch, you throw your striker, because that counts as striking the opponent. Or sorry, it doesn't count as you striking the opponent, but it counts as the opponent being struck. I'm going to leave that misspeak in there because I think that it helps clarify things. And then you immediately throw another combo. You can keep this paused for that full combo striker combo and add all of that time to the 8 seconds. That whole time, the regen is continuing to tick at its base value per half second. So this regen can potentially be a lot larger than 6%. I generally consider it a good run if I get somewhere around 15 to 20% out of it, and it can go higher. It's pretty darn good. It does require you to be able to be aggressive. It is at its best with the striker, so there are qualifications, and it is hidden, quote, behind the Special 3. But in long fights, which is one of her goals, this is very powerful. Moving on to the signature ability, this is where she gets immunity to neutralize, instantly becomes a very hard counter to Wiccan and Rintra. Love that ability. For every debuff on the opponent, their block proficiency goes down and Photon's goes up by half as much. This is another aspect of her sustainability. She can block quite well at high sig with a bunch of debuffs on the opponent. It also reduces how much block unblockable answers her, honestly. So this is going to hurt somebody like Mole Man a fair bit. It's not going to hurt a max sig Anti-Venom as much, because he'll take more damage due to the reduced block proficiency, but then he'll heal it back, which is something I kind of like, actually. And this is just generally one more threat, because this applies to her basics. This makes it that much harder to ride block and bait out heavies, if that's what you're going for. This is another incentive to have ability accuracy reduction, whether in the form of something like Falcon or somebody like Mantis, so that you just try and stop those debuffs in the first place. Additionally, this is a reason that skill champions in general are going to like having their purifies. Somebody like Elsa is a pretty good counter to Photon because even though she's not going to reduce the debuffs happening in the first place, and she can't block unblockable, if you can figure out how to parry the last hit of the special one, Elsa is pretty much always going to be purifying those debuffs off of her and getting those free precisions so that Photon's not really messing with her block proficiency and she can do plenty of damage back. That's the kind of interaction that you want to look for those just south of ideal counters against her. And then the last thing in her SIG ability, she has a up to 65% chance to inflict one of her energy vulnerabilities when struck by or blocking a light. So this is obviously the last bit of the threat for her, right? Because an unduped Photon, you can try to avoid giving her debuffs by baiting out heavies and then only countering with light attacks, kind of playing everybody as though they were absorbing man against her, only ever using lights. That stops working when she's duped because she starts applying debuffs even on light attacks. That was kind of an intentional change. Mediums and heavies are always dangerous. Light attacks are dangerous when she's duped. And this chance just keeps going up with SIG, right? So I've already seen some people say that they're going to prefer the 6-star over the 7-star. I think we'll see how that lines up. But it's definitely going to be a bit of a factor because of this last bullet. So touching on synergies real quick, her first one with Mr. Negative, her side of it reduces incoming degen by 20% for each unique personal debuff. That means she can get all the way up to 100. You can get the suppression, the energy vulnerability, the sunder, the overload, and the taunt. That does completely turn off incoming degen, but that basically requires you to be alternating the special 2 and the special 1 to keep both the taunt and the overload up. So there is definite ramp required for this. It's not just going to feel like you don't have to care about degen at all. Still quite powerful. And then Mr. Negative's side of things, when he activates his heavy charge evade, inflict a non-stacking slow debuff for 5 seconds. This is going to make him much, much better against the possibility of unfazed, which is its primary purpose. Also an extra little tool for him to use against somebody like Thing or anybody else who goes unstoppable. It's also one more debuff to deal dark energy damage from his SIG if you have a high SIG one that way. For the Marvels with CMM and Kamala Khan, all of them get a benefit for punishing the opponent's special with a heavy attack. CMM gains 2 energy charges. This works in or out of binary, so she'll ramp faster outside of binary, and it turns her 3 charges she gains on a heavy in binary into 5 if it's punishing an opponent's special. Makes it easier for her to stay there, especially if you have Nick on the team. Photon herself gets an even longer charge if you're punishing their special with a heavy as opposed to anything else. Really nice thing to go for because 6 seconds is very solid. One of my favorite things to do with this is punish a special with a heavy, go for a wake-up intercept right after it, keep hitting them, push them over a bar, and get them to throw another special. Even spamming special ones, it is much more feasible theoretically to maintain 100% uptime on pure light form with this synergy if you do it that way. And then Kamala Khan can refresh up to 3 personal buffs. Obviously that's going to be her Furies. This is pretty darn good for her. She's a fairly simple champion, but I expect to see some nutty things with this. You can still have them all fall off if the AI doesn't play along. I've seen that, but this is a very good synergy for her. Next wave with Elsa. While she's unblockable, Photon's going to deal extra burst damage as direct damage. This only scales with personal debuffs, and it's only the unblockable hits. but it is direct damage. So if you're facing somebody with energy resistance, or you're having trouble applying your energy vulnerabilities, this part won't care. So, nice little alternate damage source there. And then Elsa, when counterattacking, inflicts a slow passive. Similar to Mr. Negative, this is primarily targeted at unfazed, but she also cannot miss while this effect is active, and so this lets her take a number of defenders that she otherwise has trouble with. She can take Spidey Supreme, she could potentially handle Spot this way, and she's that much better against somebody like Thing. And then for the Mighty Avengers tag, it turns on with Luke Cage, She-Hulk, and Sam Wilson, but it's going to give any Mighty Avenger up to 1,000% physical resistance for putting debuffs on the opponent. Another person who did not make the synergy list but does have the tag, if you want to bring her and somebody else on this list, is Blade. I'll shout that out. So you can give Blade some extra physical resistance. And then, as I've said before, I normally don't touch on recommended masteries and relics because it doesn't work for every single character, but it definitely does for Photon. You want inequity. Like I said, she can get up to a 76% damage reduction, meaning that she has 4 times as much effective health. That is a really, really big deal. That's the difference between 50,000 effective health and 200,000 effective health. You want to run inequity. There are a lot of reasons to do it these days. Highly encourage it. You also very much want Despair, because while she doesn't reverse willpower, because she just turns willpower off, for any opponent that heals, such as Gore, Absorbing Man, Rintra again, if he somehow goes unstoppable against you, any of those mystics, Sasquatch is another one, you're gonna want Despair so that you can reverse, or in the case of Sasquatch, turn off their healing. Works really, really well there. You're gonna want Limber because she does go untouchable, but especially against certain stuns, it's not going to be enough. That 2.5 seconds isn't going to save you, and you're still going to get bopped on the other side. Limber helps her come out of it more often and increases the value of that ability. And then for relics, she is hashtag defensive guard, which means she gets the full benefit of the Captain America relic. That whole relic was built around Science Champion's weaponizing block proficiency, and Photon has significant block proficiency when she's awakened. So, very nice pairing there. And that's Photon. I'm really happy with her as an attacker. I expect her to basically... She's not going to put up the best scores against Mystic Defenders in Battlegrounds, but the idea is that they're not really going to be able to slow her down from getting what counts as a good score for her. And so as long as you build your deck correctly and draft things properly, she's definitely going to be able to win fights for you as an attacker. Obviously, most people are going to be placing her as a defender, but if your opponent drafts their Falcon, it was very important to me that she is able to be used both ways. Additionally, I do think we'll see some use for her in War, which was her original target with that Petrify passive, and in long-form content when that comes around again. Really happy with her. And I hope you guys can forgive me for the experience of fighting her as a defender for the first time, because I'm sure it's going to be a little bit rough. But this is the goal. That's how the game moves forward, is we need more tough defenders. We need them in War, we need them in Battlegrounds. But yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys are thinking about Photon. Very happy she's finally in the game. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.